Grace to you in peace. I'm Steve Shusett, Resource Staff and State Clerk for the Presbytery of the Highlands, and I'm here to present the second in our series of 3 videos for CPM training. The other videos can be found on the Presbytery website. We'll begin with becoming an inquirer. This is something I've mentioned before, and I'm sure I will mention it again, that this is a process of inquiry, of discovery. If someone is going through this process to become a minister of word and sacrament, and they discern along the way that that is not what God is calling them to, then we have done our job as a committee in accompanying them as they come to this important realization. If it's God's will that they do something else in their service to God in the church, rather than becoming a minister of word and sacrament, that frees them to become who God calls them to be. To become enrolled as an inquirer, a person has to be a member of and active in a congregation for at least 6 months. They have to meet with the pastor in the session because the session has to approve their moving on in this process, appointing a liaison. There will be a background check conducted through the presbytery. Policy says that we will do that prior to their becoming a candidate. I would recommend and encourage us to consider whether or not we should just come out and say before they become an inquirer, which is often how this process actually happens, to have the policy match our practice. And because we are Presbyterians, there are forms and lots of forms. And in particular, right now, I would like to mention Form 1C, which is about financial planning. And I mention this because this is more of an evolving process. 1C is required for students in part because we as a presbytery, as a CPM, as a session, want to make sure that the student isn't taking on a burden that is too heavy for them to carry financially going through this process. Being able to have an honest conversation with them if we think they ought to be a little more mindful of things than perhaps they're being. But a secondary purpose of 1C is that it's required for students to get a $1,000 grant from the presbytery, which they're eligible for each seminary year, academic year. The reason I mention this is we recently had a student who said that they didn't need the money. And so they didn't want to fill out the form. And so all we asked of them is to write a letter to us explaining that they were not in need of the funds and would not be requesting the grant. And that was satisfactory for us to keep track of the situation. This is probably going to become more common with second career or non-traditional students who may come with a more financial capacity than traditional students might have in the past. And so just for you to be mindful of Form 1C. If CPM approves an applicant to be enrolled as an inquirer, they will be introduced to the presbytery at one of its meetings and in their writing samples that they have, or not samples, but writing requirements. We are not here talking about commissioned ruling elders or CREs right now, but just for your information, because this does come up. Um, Commissioned ruling elders are not introduced to the presbytery until they complete their program and are to be commissioned. And that happens at a presbytery meeting, and that is when they would be introduced. So it's a different process. For those who are under CPM in the ordination track, they're introduced right away. Um, They are doing that after they have submitted their educational plan to CPM, including which seminary they plan to attend, and we'll talk about that more later. There are 6 written reflections that they are required to provide. And one note that we'll again be returning to, CPM is to be an active participant in this process, not passively waiting for something like an ordination exam to show us that perhaps there are questions we should have asked earlier. If we have questions or concerns at any point in the process, they should be raised with the inquirer candidate right away and not hoping that the ordination exams will somehow give us an opportunity to bring up a difficult subject that we'd really rather not address. We should address it as soon as it arises. We'll talk about this more later, but I mentioned that the educational plans have to be approved, and that includes what seminary they go to. Ordinarily, for Presbyterian seminaries, that goes by very quickly. Any seminary that's a member of the American Association of Theological Seminaries can be considered. And we have a number of students in the New Jersey area who, if they're non-traditional students again, and they aren't going to Princeton, which is where many students do go, they might be going to, for example, New Brunswick Theological Seminary or Brew Seminary. They can do that. They have to provide their program for approval, and it likely will be approved. It generally has been in the past. But it does have to be communicated to them clearly that there are requirements that they may have trouble achieving at a non-Presbyterian school because they might not offer Presbyterian polity, Reformed theology, Reformed worship and sacraments. Um, and so it's not that those seminaries won't, because sometimes they do, but on a more intermittent basis. It might not be every year. And that then affects the student's educational plan because they'll have to find an alternative. And the alternatives are out there, and we can help them track those down, but it is not a simple process necessarily. The 6 reflection questions that I mentioned concern personal, theological, and denominational aspects of their lives. These are not the most theologically rigorous questions. And in fact, when an inquirer is examined to become a candidate, we can't really even ask that, or even admitting them to be an inquirer, we don't ask them theological questions. They're students learning what they believe. So those 6 reflection opportunities are more general, and it's a baseline at this point for us to understand who they are and who they think they are and what they're thinking about. And then we can compare that down the road. Becoming a candidate. Evaluation of a candidate's fitness and readiness for a call to ministry regarding ordination. Notice the word ordination. More and more people are entering seminary not looking to become a pastor. They may be looking to become a minister of word and sacrament, a teaching elder, but not a pastor, someone who is serving a church. And so they might be looking to become a chaplain or in academia, social work. It doesn't affect their course of study or the process, but it does change the way that we need to talk to them and the examples we give of things, and not to try to pigeonhole them into something that is not what they feel like God is calling them. The final paragraph, again, if the presbytery is still uncertain about whether an inquirer's gifts are suitable for the ministry of word and sacrament, the individual needs to continue in the inquiry phase rather than establish false expectations by prematurely transitioning to candidacy. This comes up in the manual, and I have mentioned it several times. It is not the most common of events that a student going through the process suddenly stops and says, I'm not sure about this. Not that many things come up where the presbytery would step in and say, we are not sure about this. But if something should happen in the inquiry phase and the student comes and would like to be considered for candidacy, again, that's the time to raise the question, not waiting until later, but raising it then, having a chance to sort out what must be sorted out. And it may be that there are things that can be done that allow the process to continue. But until we're sure that that process should continue, they should stay as an inquirer. To be enrolled as a candidate, they have to pass the Bible content exam, otherwise known as the BCE. Many students think that because they've gone to church for their entire life, they're ready. Many people are not. It really is best for them to take the introductory Old Testament and New Testament classes before they take the Bible content exam. Some students will take the Bible content exam pretty early on before those classes. If they pass, thanks be to God for that. If they don't, then assure them, reassure them, and give them some tools with which, or some ideas with which they can consider taking it again from a position of strength rather than weakness. Um, so they can take those classes and should take those classes. There are old exams available online that they can review because some questions come up relatively often. Um, there are students who find that this is a challenging test. It seems like, well, you should know what's in the Bible. But there are different ways of thinking about scripture and different patterns that once you've taken the introductory class, those things become a little clearer to you. Um, but there are also students, admittedly, who have learning disabilities, test anxiety, where it becomes very difficult. Um, in Highlands Presbytery, we generally say that students have to fail the test 2 or 3 times before we'll even consider a request to take it to the presbytery for some kind of alternative exam. Um, the truth is that is not an easy or timely process, because what has to happen is we would meet with a student, we would talk about what kind of alternative exam would make sense for them. Could be an oral test because they have trouble with reading. It could be we do it where there's more time allowed than the BCE allows for. There are different ways that an alternative exam might happen, but we're not just agreeing with the student that this is the way to do it. Then we have to take it to the presbytery, and the presbytery has to agree that this is a reasonable accommodation to request and that the process that's been proposed is a reasonable way to achieve that. And so having a presbytery meeting called for that purpose. Would we call one? I'm not so sure. So we'd be waiting until the next stated presbytery meeting. So that can be a while. And these things all impact the student's ability to proceed in the program and in the process the way they'd like. So the first thing, I guess, is really make sure they're understanding that the intro classes should be taken that first year, and that positions them to be better prepared. Um, you'll see that they also have to complete 1 full year of seminary while under care of CPM. This is an important point because a student can begin seminary before they come under care of CPM. And for example, in my case, I took a class just to see what I thought of going to seminary, if I was really prepared to go to seminary. I'd been out of college for a little while, out of graduate school for a little while. And so this was different. And so it just as a test, I took a class. So my seminary education began the last semester of a given academic year, so January to May. But then I went to my session and met with them and went through the process to be received as an inquirer. That was months later. And so that 1 year is not simply let's start in September and move forward. You really do have to keep track. And we have a form that will allow you to do that. Students have to complete a psychological evaluation to be enrolled as a candidate, and we'll talk about that more. Again, the 6 written reflections, same questions, but we're now seeing how they've grown in the past year. And of course, more forms to fill out. Again, the inquirer has to meet with their session for formal action. CPM will meet as part of the annual consultation to talk about the 6 reflections. CPM will present the inquiry and its recommendations to the presbytery, and members of the presbytery will have the opportunity to ask questions with respect to the inquirer's Christian faith and journey, what kind of Christian service they've undertaken, how they've volunteered in the church, committees they've been on, just different ways in which they have been involved in the church, why it is they're seeking ordained ministry, and how their preparation is going. Again, no formal statement of faith, no theological questions here. And again, CPM should be an active participant in this process. Fitness and readiness. A candidate may not enter into negotiation for their service as minister of word and sacrament without the approval of Highlands Presbytery. A student can complete all of their classes, they can pass all of their ordination exams, they can have all of their forms in order, but the presbytery still has to approve them to have their forms filled out to begin seeking a call. And what the CPM is looking for, as it is from day one till the last day, are things like maturity of faith, leadership skills, compassion, honesty, and sound judgment. Those are things that there aren't check boxes for, but that's part of the reason why we're with them for 2 full years before they can even complete the process to begin looking for a position. We'll have been with them for a year as an inquirer, a year as a candidate. The liaison will talk to them, as we'll see, many more times than the annual consultation. And so we'll have a chance to gauge those things. We'll need transcripts from their college, university, and theological institution. Yes, we require Hebrew and Greek languages, exegesis, overall satisfactory grades of a C average or better. And we do have to see that they've completed all of their ordination exams. Some general information. Again, they have to be under care of CPM for 1 year as an inquirer, 1 year as a candidate. Normally, they will meet with the committee once a year for the annual consultation. But if you are someone's liaison, you are strongly, strongly encouraged to reach out to the person you are working with. Don't be a threatening once a year presence, but a frequent and non-threatening check-in. Someone who is there walking alongside them in the journey, there to help them when you can with questions they have, concerns, anxieties. If you are in touch with them once a month, once every 2 months, if you're in a position where you can meet them for breakfast or lunch, so that you have a real relationship. The way we'll get into this process more fully, but they will get their forms a month in advance, and they have to be returned a week in advance of their annual consultation. Those under care are expected to demonstrate proper conduct, and they are now required, when seminarians under care, to take boundary training, and it's the same one that is required of ministers in word ministers of word and sacrament. So this boundary training for seminarians is relatively new. They have to do it once every 36 months or every 3 years. If someone's a traditional student, they're only in seminary for 3 years. They'll only have to do it once before they have to start doing it again once they become a minister of word and sacrament. But with non-traditional students, part-time students, it could take more than 3 years. It could take 6 years. It could take more than 6 years. And so every 3 years, they have to take the boundary training. So they might have to do it more than once. Proper conduct is what we would hope for from anyone who is a pastor or a prospective pastor. Bear in mind that there is a silo relationship between particularly presbyteries and seminaries, but we are also kind of working with sessions to make things less of a silo. With seminaries, they are not responsible to the presbytery. So when we need a transcript, we have to go through the student to get it from the school. We can't just ask the school. And if something were to happen that is not proper conduct, the seminary is under no obligation to tell us that something happened. However, with the most recent changes to the Book of Order, if a session learns that something has happened that is not proper conduct, particularly if it's something involving sexual misconduct, the session now is obligated, required by the Book of Order to let the presbytery know. I mentioned the psychological evaluation, and we spell this out pretty thoroughly in the manual. The cost of this psychological evaluation is split 3 ways between the presbytery, the session, and the inquirer. It will be taken at Physis Associates in Westchester, PA, and any costs beyond the evaluation are borne by the inquirer. Inquirers can always ask sessions for additional financial help if they need it. It's their church. They can ask for assistance in the same way that someone might ask for help with an electric bill. But it's really up to them to do that. Challenging as it may be, part of growing up is learning sometimes you have to ask for help. What will happen is the student will take the exam as they are, or take the evaluation as they're able to schedule it. It's in Westchester, PA. If a student is studying nearby, then that may not be a challenge. But if they're at a more distant seminary, then they may have to arrange it when they're in town. That's not an online event. It is done in person. So there may be extra expenses beyond the expense of the evaluation itself. Travel, they might need a hotel room. Seminary students can receive, as I said, $1,000 per academic year. All they have to do is write a brief letter, a brief email to CPM explaining in general what the money would be for. In addition to books, rent, or classes, they can say, I have to take the psychological evaluation, and this money would help me to do that. Obviously, if they are looking to take the test and they need the money for that, they'll want to make sure they write that letter requesting it promptly, because some things, again, will take time. Once they have completed the evaluation at some point, Physis will send the evaluation to them, and they have to send it to us. We can also request the evaluation because we've helped pay for it. But generally speaking, we try to ask the student to submit it to us. Once we have it, a Dropbox invitation will be sent out to the members of CPM a week ahead of time to give them read-only access to the psychological evaluation. It will be there for a week. Members of CPM can look it over. You can take notes, but you can't save it. You can't edit it. You can't print it. Um, and once the evaluation has been discussed at the annual consultation, I will remove it from that file. The only copy that will remain will be in the student's file. And we'll have an electronic copy that won't go anywhere, and we'll have a hard copy that won't go anywhere. And we'll save that, particularly the hard copy, um, forever, because you never know when it will be necessary to show that this was taken and everything was in order. Um, but as long as there has been a Newton Presbytery, we have a file on every minister of Word and Sacrament and people who went through the process and didn't finish it. And in there, you will find things like psychological evaluation, except you won't find that. That really is the presbytery leader, the stated clerk, and if things were to reach that point, an attorney who was given permission. But it is secure and safe and is not available for anybody to see except those who have permission to see it. That confidential file is in the Presbytery office and very secure. The annual consultation is scheduled well in advance. The co-moderators of CPM provide the entire committee with a schedule at the beginning of the year as to when those under care will be meeting with the committee. And the liaison should communicate this to the inquirer candidate as soon as possible. That does not mean it can't change if something comes up, because things do come up. But if they can let us know as soon as possible, we can make arrangements more quickly than if they let us know at the last minute. Um, and I'll mention a little bit more about this in a moment. A month before the consultation, I will send out the required forms to the liaison, to the student, and to the co-moderators. For the student, this is to fill the form out and to make sure they get it back to us a week before CPM meets with them. The liaison and the co-moderators get copies so that they know the forms have been sent. Because one thing the liaison should not do, and this is hard for some of us, we want to be helpers and we want to make sure the process goes smoothly, but liaisons are not there to be reminding the student that they have to fill out these forms and return them. They aren't there to tell them that the deadline's coming up, make sure you get it in. When you give them the date that's scheduled, you can at that point say, and don't forget, you need to get those forms back to us and the psychological evaluation back to us a week before the meeting. You can tell them that one time. After that, they have a manual that tells them they have to submit things at least a week in advance. If they don't do that, and we have our meeting and they aren't prepared because they haven't done what they needed to do, then we will reschedule them. And that actually becomes harder than it might sound, because with the number of inquirers, candidates, and commission ruling elders that we have, that's a number of annual consultations. And so if someone is scheduled for February, but they don't make their paperwork available to us in time, there might be several months until we're able to reschedule that. And those several months can mean, okay, if you have to be an inquirer for a year, then you aren't looking toward becoming a candidate on time for that second year. That's all being pushed back now. And so someone could finish a lot of things, but still be hung up on some of the dating requirements, scheduling requirements. And so really, we don't want them to fall behind or forget. But part of demonstrating that they are ready to take on the responsibility of ministry in whatever way, shape, or form is showing that they can follow schedules and make deadlines. Because when you're a pastor in a church, if you're a chaplain in a hospital, if you are an academic at a seminary, there are deadlines you have to meet that people are depending on you to meet. And if they have to learn a very hard lesson by not meeting it with us, it's a hard lesson, but it's one they need to learn. This slide is not correct. It was made prior to some recent changes. Um, Whenever CPM meets, we meet as a committee at the designated time, and the inquirer candidate should meet us half an hour later. So they will get a Zoom invite that will have a set hour that we're all meeting, but you can communicate to them, and I will certainly try to do my best to communicate to them to be there half an hour later than that Zoom invite. And if none of us remember, they come on and we let them in and say, sorry, but we won't be able to see you for half an hour, and off we go. But if we can't remember in advance, then they have half an hour more to do whatever praying or studying or beseeching God that they need to do for that extra half hour. Hopefully, they aren't in panic mode, but whatever they're doing, they'll have half an hour after we start. You, as a liaison, should make sure you have copies of the forms so that you can make notes, and you can have a copy that the student has given you of what they wish to say, but you'll also need something to write down what we as a committee recommend, because we'll look at what they have to say, we'll interview them and discuss and chat, and we may come out with, well, we have to come up with recommendations for things they can be doing, and um, you'll have to take notes so that you can turn that into a final report. That final report is going to need the signatures of you as a liaison and the student for us to put them in their file. And at the end of the annual consultation, you'll be asked to pray for the student. Um, if that's something you are not comfortable with, then that's something you would want to make us aware of in that half hour before we actually meet with the student. It's also true that sometimes the liaison is asked to pray at the presbytery meeting if the person's home pastor is not able to be there, or no one else from the church is there who's able to pray. You might well be asked to be the person to pray for them. Here you'll see a list of the seminaries that, if attended, are summarily accepted. And we have people who have attended other seminaries like New Brunswick, which have to be approved. And as I said before, we need to make sure they understand that the required classes that I'm about to share are classes that they will still need to take, even if their seminary doesn't offer it. And those classes are, as you can see, Hebrew and exegesis, Greek exegesis. The asterisk indicates that whenever it's possible, we would like students to take the exegesis course in their original language. Exegesis, which is a way of studying scripture, can be offered in some places without the original language. But whenever it's available, we strongly encourage it. And then you can see church history, Reformed theology, Reformed worship and sacraments, preaching, pastoral care and counseling, Christian education, and PCUSA polity. And if for some reason a student seems to have some deficiency that is enough of a concern for us as a committee, we can suggest that they take additional classes to strengthen that area. I have not seen that happen, but it certainly could happen. Well, this concludes part 2 of Committee on Preparation for Ministry Training. You can find part 3, and if you'd like to review part 1 on the Presbytery website. And as always, when we meet in our regular meetings, if you have questions about the manual, questions about this video, you can always contact or bring it up at the meeting or call me or email me in between meetings, and I'm glad to talk through what some of these things mean or how I understand how the presbytery does this. And so I encourage you to do that whenever you feel it's necessary. Thank you for attending this training. Thank you for your service to the committee. And thanks to you and your church for your per capita contributions that allow us to have a Zoom license and to record these kind of videos and to have YouTube space that we can store it. All of that happens because per capita makes things happen. Grace to you all in peace and blessings. Peace be with you.